Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center. On behalf of the GeoEconomics Center and the Africa Center and my colleague, Ambassador Ramayad, we are pleased to welcome you today for this conversation on reforming the Bretton Woods institutions from an African perspective. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's IMF World Bank Meetings event series that convenes finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world. This series complements the GeoEconomics Center's Bretton Woods 2.0 projects, which examines the future of the Bretton Woods institutions and works to reimagine governance of the international financial system for the modern global economy. The challenges and opportunities for the African continent feature across the Atlantic Council's work. Just last week, at a special Atlantic Council event, the president of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, highlighted Africa's central role in addressing the challenges of the next decade. This week, the Africa Center has hosted ministers from Cameroon, Senegal, and Nigeria for public and private discussions on their priorities during the spring meetings. Simply put, Africa is at the heart of the Atlantic Council. Later today, we will host Morocco's finance minister as we look forward to the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank that will be held in Marrakesh in October. And I am pleased to announce that the Atlantic Council will be at those meetings and will launch new research on reforming the Bretton Woods system in close collaboration with our key partners at the Policy Center for the New South. But first, we have a fantastic event this morning. We are pleased to be joined by His Excellency Ken Ofori-Atta, Finance Minister for the Republic of Ghana. And we are also joined by Alexia Latortue, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And in a moment, Alexia will provide keynote remarks. I welcome the Minister and the Assistant Secretary, and I thank you both for being at the Council. Now, this event will feature a special presentation from our experts, Modibo Makalu and Amin Moheseni-Cheraghlou. Then we will hear directly from a range of distinguished speakers in a conversation moderated by Yinka Adegoke, the Africa editor of Semaphore. Yinka will introduce our entire panel and guide us through today's events. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being with us for IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. And Yinka, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited about our distinguished panel of speakers. They're going to be trying to move this conversation forward, and obviously we're going to solve the entire Bretton Woods 2.0 and what it looks like in 1 hour. But let me first introduce our speakers, because it's a really excellent panel. First, we have Otaviano Canuto, a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Sanjeev Gupta, he's the Executive Director for Financial Services at the Africa Finance Corporation. And Laure Keichel, she's the founder and CEO of the Global Sovereign Authority. Carlos Lopes, who I've followed for a long time, is the chairman of the board and chair of the Advisory Council for the African Climate Foundation. And Carmen Magarinos, she's Director for Development Cooperation in Africa and Asia, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation for the Kingdom of Spain. And she'll bring the European perspective on this topic. So welcome, distinguished guests. And with that, I hand over to the Assistant Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and good morning. Thanks to Josh, and thank you to Ambassador Yade. It's great to see everyone here today. I had the fortune to travel with Secretary Yellen earlier this year on her 3-country trip to sub-Saharan Africa. In Senegal, she gave her main speech of the trip, and she sent a very clear message. We, the United States, believe that Africa will shape the future of the global economy. This mission and vision matches what I read in a note from the Atlantic Council about your upcoming report on the Bretton Woods reform. And that is the case that sustained, robust, and green growth in Africa will not only move hundreds and millions of people out of extreme poverty on the continent, but will also accelerate a global rebound and recovery. And so I'm particularly pleased to be here this morning to speak about MDB evolution and how it relates to sub-Saharan Africa. I look forward to everyone's perspectives on these issues as we reflect on what we've achieved so far, as well as the road ahead to Marrakesh. So let me start with, why did Secretary Yellen launch this MDB evolution initiative? Simply put, it was the recognition that the world faces an increasingly number of complex global challenges that cross boundaries and disproportionately affect poor people, low-income countries, and the most vulnerable. In particular, climate change, pandemics and health security, fragility and conflict are already threatening progress on poverty reduction and achievement of inclusive and sustainable economic growth. 17 of the world's top 20 climate vulnerable countries are African. We see how climate change is dampening agricultural yields and driving food insecurity in Africa. And we've all seen how threats to global health can disrupt entire societies and economies, leading to the first increase in extreme poverty in decades. Africa has also been disproportionately impacted by global health challenges, from malaria to HIV/AIDS to Ebola. And conflict not only causes immense human suffering, of course, but it stunts economic growth, contributes to significant displacement of people, and dealing with it can stretch and deplete the budgets of government. Addressing these challenges more effectively, challenges that affect countries and local communities in very real ways, and thus these global challenges are intimately linked with national challenges, requires evolving the development banks to be fit for purpose for the 21st century. Addressing global challenges and reducing poverty and boosting inclusive and sustainable economic growth are interlinked and mutually reinforcing goals. One cannot have one without the other, and MDBs must do both. Now, this does not mean that we're moving away from the traditional work of development banks. The better we are able to tackle climate change, fight future pandemics, and address fragility in the world, the more effective our efforts will be in supporting sustainable economic development more broadly, including in Africa. We expect increased MDB support for tackling global challenges to directly benefit Africa, which is uniquely vulnerable to these challenges and less prepared, unfortunately, to manage them when they hit. So let me go now to the work that we've done at the World Bank, because we've started with the World Bank. Last autumn, shareholders at the World Bank issued a call for the institution to begin a process to involve the institution, focusing on the bank's mission, its incentive structures, its operational approach, and its financial capacity. 6 months later, it's remarkable how MDB evolution has taken center change at the World Bank these spring meetings. Importantly, shareholders have made clear that evolution must be to the benefit of all countries at the World Bank. And while we look to evolve the World Bank Group, we, the United States, remain steadfast in our support for IDA, for the poorest and most vulnerable countries. For this reason, we also urge the bank to evolve, as it evolves the World Bank, to also sustain support for IDA and find a way to deal with the declining in annual lending limits that we see coming in 2024. So at this week's Development Committee plenary, we took a solid step forward on the road to achieving our shared evolution agenda. First, we sharpened the mission of the World Bank. We now have a World Bank that will, yes, absolutely seek to end extreme poverty, boost shared prosperity, and also build resilience. Second, we began to strengthen the bank's operational model, with the bank explicitly recognizing that a country's development challenges emanate not only from country-specific factors, but also from regional and global factors. The bank will move systematically to integrate these challenges in its diagnostic work, country engagement, and how it measures results, as well as prioritizing the mobilization of private capital and domestic resources. And third, we are taking steps to increase the bank's financing capacity by responsibly stretching its balance sheet and pursuing innovative measures. Now, shareholders agreed on Wednesday to undertake reforms that could add up to $50 billion in financing over the next 10 years. That's a roughly 20% increase in the bank's current lending levels. This is progress, but there is still so much more to do. We must push forward with a staged implementation process that sees additional reforms implemented by shareholders on a rolling basis through to the annual meetings in Marrakesh and beyond, quite likely. I'd like to share with you some examples of the work still ahead. On mission, We really appreciate the work that the board has done to revise and update its mission statement. But it's the result of long discussions by the board, and it's not really understandable to the outside world. And so we now, at the political level, must ask the bank to communicate a mission that really will energize its staff and its stakeholders. And so on that note, we would like the new World Bank president, when he comes in, to really add to ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity, building resilience as a goal for the bank. On the operational model, we need to develop a concessionality framework that will guide the deployment of concessionality to the activities for which it is most needed and better links bank operation with existing pools of concessional money. In addition, we need to get quite detailed about incentives, including for staff, to work global challenges into country engagement and increase domestic resource and private capital mobilization. We also need to explore ways for the World Bank to better be able to finance at the subnational level, municipalities, for example, as well as at the supranational level. For example, when the pandemic hit, if the World Bank Group had been able to lend directly to COVAX, to Gavi, UNICEF more rapidly, it would have made a big difference. Finally, on the financing agenda, we need to push forward further implementation of the Capital Adequacy Framework report that the G20 produced, including further work to shift the equity-to-loan ratio to create more capital headroom, and also to incorporate a prudent share of callable capital into the capital adequacy framework of the World Bank Group. We need to focus more on MIGA and the IFC to be able to deliver more private capital into the challenges that we care about. This will require not just ambition and attention from the World Bank Group, but also ownership from developing countries to undertake the necessary reforms to provide the enabling environment to facilitate such mobilization. Taken together, these changes on vision, incentives, operational structure, and financing capacity will set us on a road for transformational change at the bank. And of course, these next steps coincide with President Malpass passing the evaluation agenda baton to his successor. We thank President Malpass, who was here at the Council recently, for his leadership on the first stage of the initiative. And we're very excited about the U.S.'s nominee for presidency of the World Bank, Mr. Ajay Banga. He, we believe, is the right leader to take the baton from President Malpass. He is uniquely positioned to advance this priority, and we look forward to the energy that he will bring to the World Bank Group. I recognize that MDB evolution is just part of a larger agenda that we're working on to really tackle the challenges of the continent. The work we do at the IMF, the very important work we do on debt, the work we do to really leverage all the climate trust funds to deliver for the region is all part of the challenge for the road to Marrakesh, and you have the U.S.'s commitment to work closely with you on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Assistant Secretary. Thank you very much for that really insightful talk. Now, our next speaker is very much, it's such an honor to have him here. He's very much at the center of a lot of the discussions happening. It's my pleasure to introduce His Excellency, the Minister of Finance for the Republic of Ghana, Ken Ofori-Atta. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to be here. A difficult world, but I think we have the capacity to solve it. So let me really thank you for this invitation. Today's conversation is, of course, topical for this week, particularly because developing countries presently have multiple crises playing on our tables with impacts that have devastating consequences for our people. The COVID-19 pandemic, major international conflicts, the escalating effects of climate change, and worsening macroeconomic conditions have all contributed to a sense of uncertainty and anxiety across the continent. Truly, most African economies are struggling to keep up with an estimated 546 million people now living in poverty, almost 74% more than in the 1990s. And another 149 people, non-poor Africans, risks falling into this category. And by some estimate, almost 60% of the poorest countries are either in or at high risk of debt distress, nearly doubling since 2015, with an estimated 33 African countries having interest payments approaching or exceeding government spending on health and education. The future is in jeopardy. As chair of the V20 group of countries, I have seen firsthand the immense pressure that African countries are under to cope with this new normal. Honestly, it is disheartening to watch Africa struggle in this way, especially considering the potential loss of productivity over the next decade should African economies buckle under the weight of suffocating debts. The World Bank and other MDBs exist in part to solve this problem of eliminating poverty and shared prosperity. However, they are failing to do so at the scale and speed that is required. Indeed, development partners definitely, we all talk the talk, but unfortunately what Africa has seen is that the global north seemingly has its hands full with Ukraine at the expense of financial resources for other needs. Is the world capable of reacting quickly? Yes, it is. It did so with the Silicon Valley Bank. It did so with Credit Suisse. And did it come up with scale? It did also come up with scale. So the capacity is there. But then we are talking about a population of some 1.3 billion people in Africa, of which literally 63% are below the age of 30 and 40% below the age of 14. That is the human capital for the future. At a meeting yesterday, one minister remarked, "The developing world appears to be the sideshow, but never the main theater in times of crisis." One can only ask, where is the leadership to safeguard the prospects of almost 1.3 billion people who are set to represent a quarter of the world's population by 2050 and almost 1 billion of the youth? Moreover, another question, what happened to the spirit of change that led to the formation of the Bretton Woods system and the Marshall Plan? Enlightened self-interest suggests it is time for the world to take action and create a more inclusive global financial system that works for all nations. To start, Africa must have a seat at the table in the global multilateral system to ensure that international financial architecture provides the multiple levels of financing necessary to expedite development. Representation at the highest level of multilateral development banks should be based on a comprehensive matrix that encompasses crucial factors, currently economic and political power, but really it should add the size of population, the poverty level, and the climate impact. Then we truly will be at the table. Without African representation, solutions designed by those who need them most will remain out of reach. It is said that the arc of history will bend if Africa changes. We recommend the creation of a new fund, the Recovery and Sustainability Fund managed by the IMF, for that to literally be tripled for this. This fund will be capitalized by new or existing SDRs, which will be pledged as collateral against new tradable bonds with long maturities issued by participating indebted developing countries. With the guarantees of the IRSF, the tradable bonds will command a higher credit rating and hence lower yields than the yields and interest on current external debt held by developing countries. The proceeds from these tradable bonds can then be used to retire the outstanding balance on existing debt and lead to significant reductions in debt service to more sustainable levels. Research carried out by Brookings suggests Such a structure could potentially lead to reductions in total debt service repayments of between 60 and 100 billion over the next 5 years for 77 developing countries. These resources would provide crucial resources to meet the vast and growing needs of Africa. On top of this, conversations must also continue on quota reform, a tripling of either resources and the evolution of operational procedures across MDBs to ensure they are responsive to the needs of developing countries and can support countries in building a resilient economies that can withstand shocks and deliver long-term prosperity. The only element that is missing now is the political will, strong leadership and commitment by the international community to ensure such structures are implemented as quickly as possible. Where are the leaders that led to Africa's emancipation? Where are the leaders that went through the World War? Where are the leaders that crafted the Bretton Woods institution? But there's hope. At this juncture, we have an amazing set of leaders, and they all happen to be women. Yellen, Mia Motley, Amina, and a few others. How do we use that power, that energy to move to a new trajectory? In an era of multiple crises that have ended progress in development gains, the international community has called on the Bretton Woods institution to evolve to meet the needs of the 21st century, and Alexia just enumerated those things. Time is of the essence, and the developing world calls for a spirit of fierce urgency from prominent development actors, not business as usual, and or unacceptable trade-offs with wild development gaps. So the road to Marrakesh must be a road in which not only do we have a high decibel level, but there must be action. We can't get from Marrakesh to COP28 with promises, but with real resolutions to these problems. We owe it to the people of Africa, we owe it to the V20 countries, and to future generations to seize this moment, to reform the various elements underpinning the global financial architecture so as to create a world where every nation has the chance to prosper. We can solve the problems of debt, climate, and SDG. There is enough money in the private sector that can be used for that. So in the words of Martin Luther King, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Thank you, and may God bless us.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for an excellent speech, which really provides insights and laid out what's at stake here. For our next presentation, we're going to have from the council itself, Moheseni-Cheraghlou, who's an economist affiliated with the Africa Center here, and Amin Moheseni-Cheraghlou, who's also an economist here. And they're going to give us an early presentation, insights of how a Bretton Woods reform might look like, but also it's the first step of their report, which comes out in October at Marrakesh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh, His Excellency, Mr. Minister, and Madam Assistant Secretary, for your insightful remarks, and thank you, Ambassador Yad, for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to take the next few minutes to talk about our paper that me and my co-author, Moheseni-Cheraghlou, will be working on over the next few months with the support of our colleagues at the Policy Center for the New South and our amazing research assistant from Princeton University, Kevin Ward. In a nutshell, the report will examine the urgency of Bretton Woods reform from an African perspective, while also situating the African economy into the context of the global economy. The global economy has entered a prolonged period of a slowdown. According to a new report from the World Bank, and I quote, global potential growth is expected to fall to a 3-decade low over the remainder of the 2020s. Nearly all the forces that have powered growth and prosperity since early 90s have weakened. Actually, as we see in figure 1, the slowdown has been in the making for some time now. The 5-year moving average of world's real GDP growth has declined from 3.7% in 2000 to 2.4% in 2021. Some factors that have contributed to this slowdown are growing debt burdens, as was mentioned, increasing energy and food prices, rising geopolitical fragmentation, increasing cost of climate change, and lastly, the aging population in advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies. In addition to the above issues, the triple back-to-back shocks of the pandemic, the Ukraine war, and the persistently high inflation rates and the rapidly rising interest rate environment have created new strong headwinds for the global economy. It is against this outlook that the report will present Africa's centrality in robust global recovery and rebound. In other words, we argue that a decade-long sustained, inclusive, and green growth in Africa will not only move hundreds of millions out of poverty in this continent, but it will also accelerate the pace of global rebound and recovery. This is for 3 main reasons. First, Africa is home to the world's youngest population structure, and it is expected to remain so for the future because of its robust population growth rates. Africa is home to 1.4 billion people. As we see in figure 2, a whopping 2/3 of its population is under 30, and 40% is under the age of 14. Hence, the continent will enjoy having a young consumer market with high marginal propensity to consume, and an ample supply of young and talented labor force for at least the next 3 to 4 decades. While much of the rest of the world has been getting old, as you see in figure 3, Africa's share of population age 65 and above has stayed overly constant over the past 3 decades at a mere 3%. Second, Africa is home to an incredible amount of diverse natural capital. Nearly 30% of the world's minerals, 8% of its natural gas, 12% of its oil reserves are in Africa. The continent is also home to 40% of the world's gold reserves. Moreover, the continent boasts the largest reserves of cobalt, diamond, platinum, and uranium. It also possesses 65% of the world's arable land. The continent also has immense solar and wind potential. For example, 1% of Sahara Desert area equipped with concentrated solar power plants would be more than sufficient to meet the electricity demand for all Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Third, Africa is surrounded by open seas and oceans on all sides, making it very easy to trade with. Of the 54 countries in the continent, 38 have access to open waters. The remaining landlocked countries can access open waters through at least one neighboring country. Given all the above, Africa can play a central role in the global economy. However, the continent is lagging behind the rest of the world on many crucial fronts, making it very difficult to achieve its immense potentials, not only for its own sake, but also for the sake of the global economy. Yes, there is a various heterogeneity and variation between countries in the continent, but the physical infrastructure is a case in point. As we see in this figure, 44% of Africans lack access to electricity, more than 70% lack access to basic drinking water and sanitation services, and 60% do not have access to internet, and only 2% have fixed broadband subscriptions. So to achieve its immense potential and contribute to a robust global recovery, we argue for a concentrated, big push style financial and technical support for Africa's physical and infrastructure and social infrastructure. Moreover, many African countries need help with developing their governance, financial, and legal institutions. Here, the Bretton Woods institutions can play a crucial role. A more active and focused engagement of the World Bank, IMF, and yes, WTO in Africa's development will help crowd in the much-needed institutional and private investment in the region's physical and social infrastructure. This will require a redoubled commitment from the Bretton Woods institutions to the continent, which will in turn call for significant reforms of these institutions. Some of the reforms could be increasing the operational and financial capacity of the bank, of these institutions, providing greater representation, as it was mentioned, and influence for African countries in these organizations, prioritizing programs that would integrate Africa into the global economy, interconnecting the continent's critical infrastructure and trade routes, and increasing involvement and collaboration with bilateral public and private lenders and investors, such as sovereign wealth funds and multinational corporations. To conclude my remarks, we argue that given its young demographics, its immense diverse set of natural capital, and its unique geography and location, Africa can help reverse the current downward trend in the global growth prospects. All Africa needs is a big push. Give the continent a big push, and it will help pull the global economy out of its current long-term downward cycle. The Bretton Woods institutions can and should support Africa on that front, both for Africa's sake and also for the sake of the global economy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the organizers. I'm very humbled to be here. I would also like to thank the audience for making it out here, and also those that are watching over the networks. First of all, as you can see on this map, Africa is very diverse, and you can see real growth, economic growth rates between the countries, and going from 2% all the way to double digits now. Two countries, mainly Senegal and Niger, have found natural resources, mainly oil and gas. But what unites us here today is Africa is facing daunting challenges. How do we meet those challenges? With the support of Bretton Woods institutions, mainly the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund. You know that those challenges need pressing solutions, and we need to change paradigms. We need innovative solutions, we need swifter interventions, and we need a better dialogue and more ownership, a dialogue where Africans will have a say in the solutions they want for their problems. As we know, we have a more diverse world now, and one size fits all will not make it. As you know, Africa has very small countries and very large countries, and country context is very important. So, but eventually, we have economic communities, 8 regional economic communities within the African Union, and these are putting forward solutions also to African problems. But as we move forward, you can see that we are faced with macroeconomic instability, uncertainty in the world today. Even the richest countries are having problems with expenditures, public expenditures, and also public revenues, raising public revenues as the economy is slowing, and also inflation is not tamed. And as you know, as you can see on this map, most African countries are going through adjustment because their GDP, their debt to GDP ratio is high enough, making that they don't have a fiscal space to take care of the urgent spending needs. And this is also a challenge because, as you know, macroeconomic volatility can lead to social vulnerabilities and political instability. And this is a continent that's already facing many challenges and is looking forward to sustained development and shared prosperity. As you know, also, we would need to take into account inflation. inflation is a threat to economic prosperity as purchasing power diminishes, and also it erodes the value of the currencies. As you would see, most African currency, because of monetary policies, most African countries have had to raise interest rates. And you see the lowest interest rate is WAMU, West African Monetary Union, at 3% as of March 16th. And because we have to tackle inflation, and if you don't raise the interest rate, it will be difficult to tackle inflation. But at the same time, you're making it credit more costlier. And also at the same time, you're making it difficult for investments also, because investments will fall. But also we have to take into account that fact that the fiscal space is needed also for buffers, subsidies, because as you see, this macroeconomic environment has created the fact that prices for food have risen, also for energy, and also for agricultural inputs. Because as you see, for food, Africans spend between 40 to 60% of their income on of their revenues on food, and also energy. Only 8 African countries out of 55 are net petroleum exporters. So most are net importers. So the rise of the price of petroleum poses budgetary difficulties, and also transport costs rise, and also you know that when petroleum rises, everything rises. The prices of everything rises, what we do expect from the IMF and the World Bank is support. Financial support, swifter intervention, as I said. I think there are some facilities that are already there, but the question is, how do we make those facilities work for Africans? Because as you know, debt is a big issue. Most African countries are having difficulties, as I've shown earlier here, and private investment is still falling in the African region. So how do we make sure that the IMF will provide balance of payment liquidity at a concessional rate in the medium term, and also how the World Bank could also crowd in capital markets and also risk guarantees to secure investment for African infrastructure. As you know, Africa needs about $200 billion every year for infrastructure, and electricity alone requires about $150 billion every year, and 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity. 700 million Africans live in cities where temperatures are above 25 degrees Celsius, and you have 900 million Africans that also don't have modern cooking. Exactly. So on this, I would like to say that we are living in a more diverse world, and multilateralism is the key. We are living complex problems, and we need to implement simple solutions, but we need a better, more inclusive governance from the Bretton Woods institution so that African voices can be heard and that African problems can be tackled with the help of Africans.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amin and Modibo. Now we're going to have our next speaker, Amadou Hott, who is the Special Envoy for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa and a former Senegalese Minister of Economy. And he's going to be virtual, so we're going to have him on screen. There he is. Mr. Hott, is he there? Yes, thank you. You're muted. Okay.
Yep, I think it should be okay now.
Yes, there you are.
All right.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Give me just 1 second, yeah. Yes, good morning, everybody. What I was saying is that Africa has too many challenges that urgently needs funding and expertise. And those have been exacerbated by the COVID-19, the Russian war, the inflation, higher debt, and high interest rates. There is a need for massive additional liquidity to the system to front load investments into the continent and foster transfers of skills and capacity building. Today, the approach has been to make incremental investments year on year. Such an approach will not yield the double-digit economic growth that is needed for many African nations. We must not wait 50 years to achieve goals that can be achieved within 10 to 15 years. Front-loading investments in infrastructure, climate change, and other sectors will enable the continent to leapfrog from low-income to middle-income status and beyond in a shorter period of time. During the COVID-19 and with the war in Ukraine, developed countries have demonstrated their ability to move fast and to mobilize and deploy billions, if not trillions of dollars in a record time. Africa wants its partners to have the same sense of urgency. The continent is facing the same and sometimes deeper challenges. The ongoing discussions regarding the reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions are very welcome. However, they need to progress faster, and most importantly, they need to consider Africa's views. And I really commend the Atlantic Council for organizing this session to allow us to provide some inputs. I've heard earlier my former colleague, the Minister of Finance of Ghana, Ken, providing some inputs, and we need, before these reforms are finalized, to have more inputs, I think, from the African decision makers. But let me give you just a few points. First, and most importantly, our countries need to be more involved in the governance of the World Bank and the IMF, even if we are the smallest shareholders. The perception is that the debate is being driven by rich countries, including for the policies and focus of these institutions. This needs to change, otherwise the credibility of these institutions will be more and more questioned on the continent. Africa cannot remain a passive beneficiary of the World Bank and the IMF. Second, the agenda of the reform of the World Bank should not be to provide more resources to middle-income countries to the detriment of the low-income countries, and to focus on the provision of global public goods only. The mandate of the bank, we believe, should remain to promote long-term economic development and poverty reduction while recognizing global public goods as a key element of its mission. Hence, there should be a new window at the World Bank focused on the provision of global public goods with additional resources that would avoid competition with national priorities. And that window should be accessed by all regional development banks, in particular the African development banks the West African Development Banks, AFC, and others. Investment in clean energy, reversing deforestation, pandemic prevention, water conservation, etc., benefit the entire world, or at least a broad of countries, while the costs are borne by the country borrowing for such investments. Even if they are important, countries may prioritize their own national priorities. This is why the World Bank needs to build a new facility dedicated to this kind of projects that require massive and concessional financing. And as I said, it should be accessed by regional development bank. In parallel, we urge the World Bank to do more infrastructure projects. Roads and bridges, transmission lines help build Africa, intra-Africa trade. I think the bank almost exited these sectors over the last few years, focusing more on human capital, on digitalization and climate. While these are important, without infrastructure, especially regional connectivity, there will be no economic growth to finance sustainably our social development. Third, there is a need for the improvement of processes and governance of the World Bank and the IMF, but of other MDBs as well. Processes need to be, I would say, more flexible, smoother, and we need to have faster approvals and faster disbursement processes. The World Bank should develop a common due diligence framework with other MDBs to avoid spending too much time on a single project due diligence when there are several MDBs, for example, involved in a project. In particular, the World Bank can collaborate further with regional development banks, such as the African Development Bank, as they have a stronger focus and a deeper knowledge of the regions where they operate. I mean, over the last 4 years, that collaboration has not been great. But we are hoping that with the new president of the World Bank, the collaboration will be tighter, deeper for the interest and for impact on our countries. Lastly, I would like to make 2 points that are specific to the IMF very quickly. The RST operationalization. Sorry?
Well, we have a hard stop, so if we could just wrap up, please.
Just very quickly. On the RST operationalization, Rwanda got an approval of $319 million. And the RST was planning, the reallocation of SDRs was for $100 billion. And Africa so far received $319 million, I believe, with only actually Rwanda. We need to find a process to fast track the disbursements of the reallocation, in particular for the RST. And also for the IMF, I think reviewing the quota rules, I think would help us actually provide Africa with more SDRs in the future, in particular during financial crisis.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, so sorry that to have to cut you off, but we have a hard stop here in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your insights. The thing that keeps on coming up, the word I keep on hearing for my panelists, and I'm sure you're hearing the same thing, is speed, fast, do things efficiently. This has just come up with every presentation, from the minister, everyone has been concerned about the urgency of now, what we need, how we need to move this forward. I'll start with you, Otaviano. Please just talk a little bit about, how do we get to move with these reforms? How do we move forward in a way that's both speedy and efficient?
Right. First of all, thank you for having me here again, personally, and also on behalf of the Policy Center for the New South, we want to thank for the opportunity of a partnership with the Atlantic Council. The fact of the matter is that so far, what we have in documents and what's going to be discussed by ministers, for instance, tomorrow at the Development Committee, is just the first step that we would say, as my former colleague Rachel Kite called it, short-term fixes. The G20 capital adequacy framework, for instance, made some great suggestions on how to, let's say, the World Bank could become bolder when it comes to taking risks and stretching its financial capacity to support the countries. But this is still something, let's say, small when it comes to size. By simply tweaking the capital, the equity to loan ratio, as suggested in the World Bank document that's going to be discussed tomorrow, the World Bank might be able to lend more $50 billion in 10 years, that is to say $5 billion per year. It's remarkable. It's just a change from 20% to 19% in the equity to loan. But fact of the matter is that this pales when one thinks of the estimated necessities of finance from developing countries, including Africa. Just one point at the outset. I want to praise the points mentioned by Mondibo and Amin on matching perfectly the sources of the types of multiple types of crises that we have had, and how having a decade-long growth, sustainable inclusive growth in Africa might be a way out for the global economy in all respects. And it is very fortunate in pinpointing how the features of Africa makes it exactly the best candidate for, let's say, pulling back the global growth that the World Bank in a report a couple of weeks ago suggested to be heading towards a lost decade.
Yeah, right. Sanjeev, I wanted to ask you about the scale, because that's another word I heard, the scale of the challenge here. I mean, what kind of size does the World Bank or the IMF need to be? Or if you reform these, what kind of structures do you think are needed for them to meet this challenge, right? As laid out so well by Amin and Mondibo.
Yeah, so obviously good morning to everybody, and I think we're being a bit gender insensitive.
Yeah, I know, started.
So
I was just talking
my apologies for that. Okay. But, when I was coming this morning, I was thinking to myself that, there is this old cliche that more things change, more they remain the same.
Right.
Right? And in many ways, it kind of comes from this other very favorite quote of mine, which is they call it the definition of insanity, where you keep doing the same thing and expect different results. And in this particular scenario, with all the conversation that's been going on, I almost was telling myself that it's not about doing the same things and expecting different results, but it's also us as the people, the generation we come from, trying to find solutions to the problems we created in the first place. So to a large extent, I think this conversation needs to be wider, needs to bring in much more younger people from the world, because we are looking at stuff through our own prisms, and that cannot be good. Okay? So my daughter keeps pointing out that you are the problem generation, so how can you be part of the solution? But having said all that, I think the word reform itself worries me, and I'll come to the scale question. Because to me, reform kind of seems to suggest that there is some guilt here, there is some mistakes here. I think the word is really about evolution, right? And in the last few days in DC, I picked up a few important pointers. One is, somebody said at the Carnegie Mellon Foundation panel, where Carlos was there as well, that the Bretton Woods institution almost doesn't have relevance if Africa is not going to be looked at.
Right.
It almost becomes irrelevant, correct? And that's a very powerful statement. The other is Secretary Yellen's comments in many of her speeches, where one thing that comes out again and again and again is the need for these institutions to work with local institutions, to get into that capacity that local institutions have, the knowledge they have for things to change at grassroots. And that is a change that needs to happen. The third pointer that I picked up, and this is really newfound knowledge, as I said, the last 72 hours, is when David Malpass was speaking at the conference, he alluded in many ways the shortage of capital. And I was listening with a lot of amusement to the Minister of Finance of Ghana, where he so elegantly put it that when it comes to crisis, we do find money. We solve the Silicon Valley Bank problem. We solve the Credit Suisse problem.
Yes,
so we need to solve the Africa problem. And I'll end by saying that the paradigm shift, which somebody referred to, is where reforms will come from. And the paradigm is stop looking at Africa as a problem. Look at Africa as a solution to your problems, be it food security, be it energy security, be it access to critical minerals, be it new markets, be it just managing the geopolitical risks. Because if you don't have that paradigm shift, you are not going to reform anything for the better.
Fantastic. And where do you think the priorities should be in terms of when we think about these reforms or the completely new approach to multilateralism and development?
Look, I think the question of speed, I would like to come back to this because this is absolutely important. Actually, you know what? A lot of crises can be avoided and actually can still be avoided while others can be solved. So let me slightly explain what I mean by this. I mean, we're all seeing the debt amount that Africa has to deal with this year, next year. It's very clear, right? And we can deal later about sustainability because indeed more fundamental reforms need to change, but you have urgency, okay? Right. And this debt, there is a liquidity problem also starting to come also because some countries are finding it extremely difficult to fund themselves in their own domestic market, which used to be one way that they could manage the overall risk, right? So it's in front of our eyes, and it's coming very quickly because at the beginning of the year, some of those difficulties in the domestic market I'm alluding to did not exist. So we know that we are going into trouble. We know, we see it coming, okay? So we could sit and do nothing and say, well, okay, you need to adjust your fiscal or you need to do, but we all know that this cannot be done or this can be done to a certain extent because no, people are not accepting cutting subventions so easily. No, you cannot squeeze a fiscal space more than what you've already done in some cases. So I think we need to face this reality to understand that having those countries go to crisis is much worse than kind of like helping them now. And this means kind of like both everybody acknowledging the crisis, okay, and trying to find solution. When I say acknowledging the crisis, it also needs to come from the countries themselves, right? And not to say no, and be in denial and not willing to kind of like solve it. But it also means that speed of kind of like getting liquidity, finding solution is hugely, hugely important. Do those solutions exist? Of course they do. And they are actually, sorry to say this, pretty basic. You cannot fund development with 10% debt or 12% debt. I mean, you cannot fund social spending with 8% debt. It does not make sense. It just, and it has never made sense. It will never make sense, okay? So for those investments, you need concessional financing. And that's what most Africa and developing countries needs, those type of money, okay? If for whatever reason, because they're not available, because they're slow to come, they are slowly shifted to go to the likes of people who would lend them at 10%, this is something that then we overall will have to deal with, right? So somehow we need to stop the kind of like shifting from one creditor to a bad creditor to a worse creditor, okay, to try to basically find a joint solution there. So I think I'm urging everybody to recognize the problem, to try to find those liquidity, to kind of like, accelerate immediate sources of funding that can be dispersed. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that countries are exonerated to do the reforms. But reprofiling of debt are an urgent need that we should actually be doing in the next 3 to 6 months. And honestly, better 3 than 6, okay? Right. And so this is hugely important. But again, this does not mean reforms don't need to be done. They need to be done because otherwise, same thing, it's going to hit you back. Okay? But also, we need to also acknowledge that sometimes the way we look at economies, can be challenged. When some of the ratios that you're looking at are ratios with exports, for sure they make sense. But you cannot have debt which is immediate and export, be considered at the same level because having an export strategy takes time. And it has taken time for every single country in the world, right? Yeah. Let alone one that is starting from very far, right? So we also need to acknowledge that by giving the same weight or close to the same weight to debt to GDPs and ratios that involves exports, it needs to be thought through. And we need to give also, or to help the country have the means of have an export strategy, okay? Because if you're just saying, okay, your debt is not sustainable because of your export being weak, okay, true, but then you cannot incur debt and then you cannot develop yourself. So we need to also, get out of this kind of injunctions that we're giving that frankly don't make sense from a development point of view. So I think I guess what I'm saying is, on the long term, I could not agree more around all what has been said. I guess I'm saying something around the urgency, not to have something that is worse, And again, it is what sometimes frustrates me or kind of gets me sometimes upset is that it can be solved. It's not, and it honestly, it's not
rocket. Think it's complicated.
No, exactly. It's not rocket science at all. But if we don't do it, we're going to trip into much more difficulty. So I'm just urging for this.
No, fantastic. Carmen, we have you here as giving us the European perspective, but I mean it's important, right, for Spain. Where do you see the priorities? Because I mean Spain itself has been through its own challenges in the recent past. Where do you see the priorities when you think about reform for the African continent?
Yeah, thank you. I mean I'm here to speak as a European voice.
Yes.
But I have to say that Spain is in this context, a very special European country, because we are not just the closest neighbor to Africa, but we have African territory. So we consider ourselves an African, a partly African country. And that's why Africa is in our agenda, and in our international agenda, but very specifically in our cooperation agenda. And before developing, I wanted to point out that I'm also speaking from the side of an agency for development cooperation that might be slightly different from what we have heard here today. But there is many elements of convergence of your views, the points that you are raising, and the points that I need to be raising today also. First, and you have just mentioned, is the urgency. We have an analysis of Africa, of the context of Africa, of what is happening now in the continent that is very worrisome because of the vulnerabilities that are really just an evidence, but also about the uncertainty. Let me share with you, we were discussing with some colleagues of the African Union earlier this week, and one colleague was just telling us, we don't know what is going to happen in Africa tomorrow. So we are in a moment in which we need to prepare to a future that is more and more difficult to foresee and to understand. And I think that it comes to my second point, and is related to your point about the reform, and is the reaction. We need to develop very fast and steady and quickly capacity of reaction. And we see that when we work on development, and usually they are middle-term and long-term programs, but we are really trying from a Spanish perspective and a European perspective to try to develop this capacity to react more steadily. So I'm very happy that we are all saying here today that with this Bretton Woods reform, we need to be fast. We are trying to be fast, and I just want to share something with you, is that, for instance, we have just passed a few months ago in January, a new bill for international cooperation. And there we have put this need to be fast, to be reactive, to be quickly reactive in the front. We have included a new boost to financial cooperation, because as you have mentioned, I mean, we cannot keep ourselves on the ground of the classical development cooperation. Africa is changing, is very quickly transforming, and financial cooperation and tackling financial issues have to be in our international cooperation. And of course, since we are here talking about Africa, Africa is one of our top priorities because of all the reasons I have explained, both bilaterally and regionally. And let me just finish by saying that I think that all the work we can do as a country or as a European Union as a whole have to be reinforcing not only our bilateral programs, but also trying to reinforce the regional integration of the continent. You have just mentioned that it has a lot of potential in terms of trade, of economic development. This has to be by supporting, and we are doing it with CEDEAO and ECOWAS, and the African Union.
Right. Excellent. Carlos, it's a pleasure to have you, and sorry for keeping you to the end. But maybe the way we'll come with you is to almost give what you might call the African perspective, right? And like what do we as Africans think about this in terms of what the priorities should be? I'm interested in how you've thought about this reform and what needs to happen and where you would like your priorities would be from the African perspective.
Well, thank you, and thanks the Atlantic Council for inviting me and for an excellent voices that I have heard so far. I really believe that from an African perspective, first let's start with the why. And we have to be honest, this reform is not coming because Africa is facing problems. This reform is coming because there are a number of changes in the world of multilateralism. We have WTO rules that are being challenged with new forms of protectionism. We have friendly shoring becoming the new normal. We have tax systems that are now creating opportunities for global taxation. We have the supply chains that are being completely disrupted and changed after the pandemic. We have geopolitical decoupling that is changing the way we deal with technology. We have the dollar standard that is being challenged with the interventions that we heard from President Lula this very week. So we have all these changes, and the why goes further. When it comes to Africa is because we have 5 decades of experiences in development, and we are exactly in the same structural place where Africa was 5 decades ago. We continue to be commodity dependent to the highest degree in relation to any other region. We continue to have the lowest levels of industrialization. We continue to be the food insecure region. We continue to have the largest number of poor. So what has 5 decades of development accomplished? And when we look into the reasons why we are in this situation, we then get into the what. And the what is that, if you look just into 2015, when the SDGs were approved, there was a document published by the multilateral development banks with the title Billions to Trillions. Where are they? And the climate financing promises many times over, where is it? And the pandemic response in terms of the instruments that have been put together for dealing with the debt-stressed countries, what they have achieved, very little. So all of these things basically demonstrate that we have kind of exhausted trying to deal with these issues with the idea of solidarity. It's not really solidarity when you approve a huge package to deal with a crisis like the pandemic by the IMF, and then only 5% goes to Africa, which is supposed to be the most affected region for a number of criteria. So I think the what is also about the way these organizations over time have accepted a certain comfort zone in defining the problem. They think that the macroeconomics has to be managed to meet external obligations alone, as if there was no domestic reality, as Anne-Marie was highlighting. The interpretation of comparative advantages that is very static. It's always about natural resources. It's always about what Africa can produce for others to develop. The way we evaluate risk, that is completely skewed and does not take into consideration real macroeconomic criteria sometimes. if we compare with other regions' treatment. The way we deal with liquidity access. There is no development without access to some forms of liquidity. And the countries in Africa can even grow at 8-10%, and they will face liquidity problems, will pay prohibitive interest rates. And of course, the fact that we don't recognize that most of the problems have obfuscated this Africa rising narrative that was so much fashionable in the first decade of this century, because of exogenous shocks, not because of things that the Africans did wrong. So, and then we get into really the how. And the how is partly what, Minister Ofori-Atta mentioned, incrementally should be done for some of the responses to start kicking. And that, as Otaviano recognized, it's very little. It's very incremental and very little. These are timid reform proposals so far. They are not really focusing on low-income countries. And I would say that they are not really looking into the opportunities like Sanjeev mentioned. The return on investment in Africa is still great, despite all the risks, despite all the difficulties. This is not really part of the discussion on reform. So I think not recognizing that Africa is a terrain of opportunity is part of the problem. And I think, like Amadou mentioned, not having infrastructure as a priority, not building much more on local knowledge is also a problem. So we really know more or less what the diagnosis is. You will hear over and over, as I'm hearing, that the Africans don't have clarity on what they want. It's too many things. It's fragmented, it's atomized. Maybe in the way of expressing them, because the frustration level is quite high. But it is pretty clear what needs to be done. Okay. And it's not very complex. In fact, if you just look into the rescuing of not just the SBV and Credit Suisse that was mentioned, but many times over, different crises that have started since 2008, 2009, we know that the only way this crisis can be tackled is by not following a rule book that is not flexible enough to allow for certain types of intervention that deal with emergency situations. Okay. If climate is not considered an emergency big enough, if Africa is not considered an emergency big enough, we have a problem. And I don't think that the roadmap to Marrakesh can be really just an accommodation of management, efficiency, speed, and all that. All those things are important, but they are not sufficient.
Thank you very, very much for that, Carlos. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just really want to just make sure that we come back to all the panelists and at least just one point. And I just want to emphasize this point about priorities, right? Because it's quite clear that the urgency is very much in this room, right? What is your number one priority, Otaviano, in terms of what needs to, if you could just do one thing to move this thing forward?
Well, I have to make it double. Well, we spoke about the necessity of concessional finance.
100%, yeah.
Particularly in the case of low-income countries and so on. Well, the performance of donors in the last few rounds of IDA has been really disappointing. And the issues that I was referring to in terms of widening the space for lending without jeopardizing the credit ratings of the World Bank, this has more to do with financing middle-income countries, not the case of low-income countries. So first point, we have to revisit the issue of the IDA and other forms of concessional funding. Okay. And the other point is obviously the following. Carlos is correct when he pinpointed that, from the idea from billions to trillions was much. But the point is, Carlos, still the principle applies. It does not suffice to have simply funding financed by multilateral institutions. It has to be done in a way that crowds in other forms of finance, private sector, and so on. Otherwise, we'll not be able to get even close to one needs. So this has implications for these institutions. Instead of focusing on lending, they should pursue the opportunities for providing guarantees and being more risk prone to accept risk and so on. So this matters, regardless of whether we haven't succeeded to move from billion to trillion. But that's a principle that has to be there.
Okay. Sanjeev, your
Yes,
priorities?
quick couple of points. I think the speed issue has come up a few times.
Yes.
And I was listening very intently to my good friend Carlos, because he always makes good sense, is that, behavioral scientists will tell you that speed comes from a sense of urgency.
Right.
And sense of urgency usually arises from a sense of necessity, right? Or fear. Now, I think it is up to us in Africa to have that narrative going that don't do it for Africa, do it for yourselves. Be it your need to diversify your supply chain and all the other things we talked about, food security, energy security,
right,
access to critical minerals. Because urgency will not come unless a sense of fear comes out of a sense of necessity. And that's for Africa to work on, right? The quick comment on what I would like to see, allow me to just quickly explain in 30 seconds the Africa Finance Corporation business model, because that will allow me to answer the question. We were set up to develop infrastructure in Africa. Very quickly we realized that to develop infrastructure commercially, you need industry, because industry is the demand side. Yeah. And to develop industry, you need to add value and processing of primary goods in Africa, because as you know, most primary goods get exported out with no value addition. So we have successfully created this triangulation, as we call, infrastructure, industry, value addition. In the middle sits project development for us, because without spending early stage capital to develop projects, projects don't become bankable. So all of that together allows me to make that one final point. What I would love to see is not necessarily direct funding, but what you said, credit enhancements, insurances. $1 billion that the World Bank may have to deploy to Africa goes a much longer way if it is used as a guarantee against which private sector capital can come in.
I see.
And that's what I would like to see. Thank you.
Excellent. And no?
Yeah, I could not agree more. I was actually going to go on the guarantee point. No, not at all. It just shows how important it is. And indeed, the need to kind of deploy the capital in a much more wiser way. I guess the way I'm going to summarize it is to say, let's have a two-step approach. Make sure we have the liquidity taken care of just immediately, while at the same time we work on much more sustainability and kind of trying to either renegotiate the debt, lengthen them, try to do some things that make more sense. And, if it's acceptable sometimes to also try to see what we can forgive or when we can swap into something that makes sense.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Amin.
thank you. And I mean, completely in line with you, and I think it reflects our attempt to improve our work in financial cooperation. Is just exactly as you have said, and it has a role to play with the development of the autonomy of the continent, which I think is crucial. But in terms of development, I need to mention that we are trying to influence the agenda, the development agenda, with two ideas in mind.
Whose agenda, sorry, are you trying to influence?
The international cooperation for development agenda in Africa. With one main idea in mind is that we have to look to the future. And to look to the future, there is two key issues that I think have to be in the agenda. One is the need to address the questions of the future generations, so we have to work with the young people, and there is many voices who have said that, but we have to do it properly, giving the young people the space that they need to build their future. I mean, we are, I think, in this table, we have an age that we are, but we have to make an extra effort to really give the space to the new generations.
Right, I see.
First, and the second one, and is something that was mentioned in the previous part of the session, but not in this one, and is the accent I think we have to put on climate finance. It's a global challenge that is an underlying element that is going to have an effect not only on development, but also in economic development, in the survival of all us. So climate finance and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have an opportunity with this reform to really boost this climate financing agenda, which we hope they will take. And I just want to finish by saying that we, Spain, as the coming presidency of the European Union in the next semester, will be trying to boost this African agenda and this climatic financing agenda.
Fantastic. Carlos, your last word, 2 minutes on your priorities.
Well, you know, Carmen mentioned the fact that Spain has a bit of an African touch and territory. We have been talking about the Marrakesh annual meetings, and that is not even considered by Bretton Woods institutions as Africa. So they treat Africa as sub-Saharan Africa. The reports that talk about Africa are about sub-Saharan Africa. It's just an indication of sort of colonial legacies that endure and that are very difficult to surpass. And I think it's just a manifestation of how much we need to change in terms of perceptions, because that, for instance, undermines a continent-to-continent approach that Africa is building with the European Union. It undermines its continental free trade area. It undermines a number of possibilities for regional integration by just having this sort of division that is as artificial as any. But in this case, you know, it goes against the African Union existence that has become absolutely fundamental for the future of the continent. Now, in terms of being very precise, I absolutely agree with Anne-Laure that the number one priority is liquidity. We have a short-term urgency that really requires the kind of swift response that we have seen over and over in different moments of crisis recently, that is not yet sort of getting traction, not enough traction. And whatever we do about it is going to be giving or not opportunities to discuss the remaining points we have raised.
Carlos, thank you very much. That brings our panel to an end. Thank you to our excellent panelists, everyone. And now I hand over to our co-host, Ambassador Rama Yad.
Thank you, Yinka. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to close this unique event, and an event that closes the Atlantic Council programming during this week of spring meetings. Undoubtedly, it was a flagship event, given the number of speakers, like 13, the diversity, a strong combination of private sector, development organizations, financials, and officials, and also the high quality of their exchanges and vision. It was important to put Africa at the center of the Council's work. As you can see, this year, the Africa Center has partnered with the GeoEconomics Center. We don't want Africa to be isolated or Africans speak only to Africans. By including our colleagues, we can benefit from their expertise. Modibo and Amin's excellent presentation reflected that cooperation very well. When an expert like you, Amin, who has nothing to do with Africa and the Africa Center writes, Africa can help reverse the current downward trend in the global growth prospects. All Africa needs a big push, and the Bretton Woods institutions can and should support Africa in that front, both for Africa's sake and its 1.4 billion population, and also for the sake of the global economy. It's not about supporting Africa, it's about supporting the world. You can understand how important for us it is to shape Africa's future together with who believe in its leading role. We will continue this conversation in Marrakesh at the annual meetings of October, when we will have the pleasure to cooperate again with the Policy Center for the New South and publish together an important policy report. I think Otaviano here, Canuto, can testify of that. He's the future author with Hafez Ghanem of a report with our two friends here. So from Secretary Yellen to David Malpass, the Council has hosted this past year key actors of the Bretton Woods system. Yellen has set the tone by saying on this very stage in April 2022 about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and multilateral banks, while I feel they should play an important role going forward, they need to be modernized to address problems that are really challenges that we face today, and these institutions were not really designed to address. Echoing her, President Macky Sall, as African Union Chair, another Africa-centered guest, said during the US-Africa Summit, beyond our national and continental responsibilities, Africa's place in the international system also depends on fairer and more equitable global governance. The rules are unfair, outdated, and need to be disputed. Today, it was not only a conference or an event, it was a public session of work between excellent experts under the smart moderation of Yinka Adegoke here from Semaphore. We are always delighted to cooperate with. We heard our guest of honor, His Excellency Finance Minister of Ghana, Ken Ofori-Atta, stress the difficult times we have today. But he said, we have the means to solve it. And he said, we are failing to do so at the scale and speed required. Speaking on behalf of the Biden administration, Alexia Latortue, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the Treasury, stressed the necessity of reforms, visual, incentive, with financial capacity. She's excited about the US nominee, Ajay Banga, and we hope that this very tough portfolio will be helpful for this huge task. And after hearing Amadou Hott, the FDB Special Envoy for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure, highlighting a long list of challenges, including the necessity to support the infrastructure, Sanjeev here, Gupta from Africa Finance Corporation, another development organization in Africa, asked the right question, how this generation which created these problems can be the solution. And like Otaviano, Sanjeev is also from this global south, you know. Two giants, India and Brazil, right? We often forget when it comes to the competition between global powers on the African continent. And I think Otaviano, President Lula is in Beijing these days, right? I don't know what they are doing, but reforms are everywhere, obviously. She did not speak as French, but as a French on behalf of another old partner, France. But she shared her experience as friend of Africa, an advisor of so many African presidents, and Laure Kichel, founder and CEO of Global Sovereign Authority. She said, solutions are pretty basic. The weight of debt does not allow more expenses. Money is slow to come. And she urges everyone to find more liquidity and direct additional fundings in the next 6 months, right? Did I hear well?
Yes. 3
I said 3, even less. Okay, okay.
Better 3.
I don't know if the new president of the World Bank will be at work at that moment, but maybe the acting. And maybe Carmen Magarinos, Director of Development Cooperation at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, could more speak on behalf of Europeans. And she did great by stressing the autonomy, the necessity to have a sovereign continent through 2 keys in the agenda, the global agenda. First, give space to the future generations, and 2, work on climate finance. last but not least, Dr. Carlos Lopes, former Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, but he's much more than that, very eloquently highlighted a lot of changes that happened these last decades, but he regretted the same structure as 5 decades ago, including the largest number of poor in the world are in Africa. It's a failure. The way we deal with liquidity is a problem, like Anne-Laure Kichel said. The prohibited interest rate is also something important. And he's always sad to see that there's no focus on low-income countries. So thank you very much, everyone, for this promising conversation. Clearly, African countries no longer seem to want to settle for words. Inaction is not an option anymore. The absence of change from international financial institutions has encouraged various emerging markets to move forward and set up systems to rival the Western-centered institutions. The BRICS have their own IMF, their own World Bank. On their own, Africans have refused to wait for action from financial institutions. From Côte d'Ivoire to South Africa, African countries have been setting systems to tackle COVID, for example, the African Union as well, the FDB as well. And by taking actions on their own, Africans have shown that they can be a powerful yet reasonable voice in multilateral and financial institutions, but with a greater voice and more agency in institutions, they could do more. The world can grant them that voice by opening up guaranteed African seats for the UN Security Council, for the G20, for example, more voting power.
Correct, that's important.
But nothing would be possible without the mobilization of the private sector. And as Modibo said, private investment can play an important role in economic development by providing capital for business to grow and create jobs. So, because we know that the reform of the multilateral organization would be pointless without a strong mobilization of the private sector, the Africa Center will also work on the bottlenecks that limit investments, capacities, and allow access to private capital. And our senior fellow, another one, Dr. Franny Leuchi, is drafting these days an Africa Center policy report in partnership with Goldman Sachs, thanks to the personal commitment from our chairman, John Rogers. So thank you again. I feel Jasper's pressure on me to stop talking. Happy to stop there and see you in Morocco. Bye-bye.